Welcome to Lesson 2, Introduction to Ethical Hacking. This lesson explores several general concepts with respect to ethical hacking. We'll begin with an overview of InfoSec, discuss attack concepts, phases and types, and wrap it up with InfoSec policies.
If you're listening to me and viewing this course, you already know that cybersecurity is very important for any organization, right? So the number of cybersecurity attacks will continue to rise. Whether you actually pick your favorite news site, you look in Twitter, look in LinkedIn, you actually see on a daily basis news about cybersecurity, whether it's a breach of a large company or a government institution or just new cybersecurity attacks overall. So the demand for safe and secure data and other concerns means that companies need professionals like you and me to keep their information safe, to find vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. Now, cybersecurity risk includes not only the risk of a data breach, but also the risk of the entire organization being undermined via business activities that rely on digitization and accessibility. That is why learning how to develop an adequate cybersecurity program and also how to hire individuals in an organization that can mimic an attacker and that can evaluate the overall security postures of that organization is crucial for any organization. Now, cybersecurity can no longer be something that you delegate to the IT department or the information technology department. Everybody needs to be involved, including the board of directors. So from the board of directors to the new hire that you actually onboarded into your company yesterday. Now, many individuals confuse the traditional information security or InfoSec with the new cybersecurity capabilities that we have to have nowadays. In the past, information security programs and policies were designed to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data within the confinements of the organization itself only. However, that is no longer sufficient. Organizations are rarely self-contained, and the price of interconnectivity is exposure to attack and malfeasance out there. So whether you have data in the cloud, whether now you're actually adopting IoT technologies, or you do business-to-business transactions, and of course you adopt new modern techniques, every organization, regardless of the size or geographical location, is a potential target, and cybersecurity overall has to be a process of protecting information by preventing, detecting, and responding to modern attacks. Now, cybersecurity programs and policies recognize that organizations must be vigilant, resilient, and ready to protect and defend every ingress and egress connection, as well as the organizational data wherever it's stored. Like I mentioned to you before, it can be in the cloud, it can be on-premise, it can be in a hybrid solution, and also with business partners, right? So again, the data, how is it stored, transmitted, or processed? Also, cybersecurity programs and policies expand upon the traditional information or the InfoSec program, but also include a few additional things like cyber risk management and oversight, threat intelligence and information sharing, third-party organization software, hardware dependency management, incident response and resiliency, and of course, what we're actually here for, offensive security, the way to proactively look for vulnerabilities before the bad guys or adversaries actually do so. So that's why it's so important for you to develop better programs and procedures within the organization and hire qualified individuals. And that's why we're here, to become a better offensive security professional. In this lesson, we will go over the different threats and attack vectors in today's environment. One of the things that actually I want to mention, and I'm going to cover a lot of these concepts throughout this lesson, is of course, the different threats and malware types that we actually see nowadays. But I want to also share a few resources that go a little bit beyond into what the exam may actually just ask. One of the first resources that I would like to share with you is the Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge Framework from MITRE, right? So the MITRE Attack Framework. And basically what it is a curated knowledge base and model for different attacker behavior, techniques, and tactics that are used in today's modern attacks and sophisticated attacks, right? So the full attack matrix below it's actually shown in their website. So it's attack.mitre.org, as I'm showing here. And if you see on the top, they actually classify them based on the kill chain process, right? So from initial access to execution, persistent, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access, discovery, lateral movement, collection, exfiltration, and command and control. If you actually click on any of these, you have a lot of details about each of those techniques, not only the actual technical information about the techniques, but also the threat actors and how they actually have used these techniques and types of attacks in order for them to actually exfiltrate information, perform sophisticated attacks, compromise many organizations, and even in modern breaches out there, right? So it actually provides a lot of information from the technical capabilities and the tools being used, as well as the actual threat actors, as you can see in the screen. So again, even outside of the exam, I will definitely advise you to become familiar with that framework, because it's actually used nowadays by many different organizations to both to protect their network and also by offensive security individuals or organizations that would like to keep up with the adversaries and learn the new techniques and different methodologies that actually they use in today's environment. Now, going to the threats specifically around malware threats, you probably are very well familiar with these, because traditionally we have called them viruses and worms, because they're actually the larger category of malicious code or malware out there. But today you actually have things like ransomware, Trojan horses, backdoor, covert channel tools, spyware, different types of malware to create botnets, so the collection of compromised systems to then carry out other attacks, whether it's denial of service, exfiltrating information from companies, or other types of advanced persistent threats. Now, you may be already familiar with some types of malware, including viruses and worms, where they actually replicate and infect other systems and propagate in a massive manner. That massive amount of traffic can actually lead to other collateral damage, like a denial of service attack, very quickly, or infecting and compromising all the data, right? You also may be familiar with things like spyware, into the fact that they can be installed in systems to steal information from the user and also to eat up bandwidth and resources from a system, right? But you also have other more sophisticated types of malware, including Trojans, backdoors, and ransomware, right? Things that can infect and compromise other types of computer resources. For example, master boot record infection. This is actually the original method of attack in some cases, and it works by attacking the master boot record of a hard drive or an SSD, right? Any type of modern media device. Now, you also have file infection, right? Which, traditionally it's usually done, it's been relying on executing files in a compromised system, and that includes, of course, executables like .exe and .com in traditional Windows, or specific images for Mac OS X and Linux as well. So no system is actually immune to this type of vulnerabilities and to this type of malware. Also, you have macro infection, which is actually a different type of a malware that began actually appearing in the 1990s, and basically macro infection exploits different scripting services installed on your computer. So you may remember a long time ago a virus called I Love You, right, that propagated. That was actually an example of macro infector. Now, cluster is a type of virus that can modify the directory table entries so that it can point a user or a system process to the malware and not the actual program. Another one is actually multi-partite, and that's a style of virus that can use more than one propagation method. That includes actually targeting both the boot sector and also program files. Also, even from things like memes, right? Even though there's not a virus, it actually spreads from one system like the other one. So memes, and I'm talking about, yes, the memes, of the internet. An example of somebody actually sends you a chain email and asks you to forward it to tens of your friends, or even via Facebook or any type of social media, including Twitter, of course, that can also spread very quickly, and in some cases actually can consume bandwidth and be disruptive. But nowadays, let's look at some of the recent type of malware examples. And one of the most devastating one is ransomware or ransom malware. And it's a type of malware that actually prevents users from accessing their system or personal files because the threat actor basically encrypts either portions of their data, so specific directories, or the whole system, or even the master boot record in some cases, so you cannot even boot your device, right? And what they do is they demand a ransom, a payment, in order for you to regain access and potentially send you some decryption keys. Now, there are several different ways that ransomware can infect your computer. One of the most common methods is through malicious spam or phishing attacks, right, with unsolicited emails, and where you may be fooled to click on an attachment like a PDF or a Word document that may also contain links to malicious website. And from there, of course, you can actually download the malware, right? Now, there are many different methods of propagating via social engineering, but in the past, actually, we also have seen several examples of malware, specifically ransomware, spreading via other methodologies, especially through SMB and known exploits. And two examples of those are the Niera ransomware and WannaCry, right? So those has been traditionally, very well known to be very disruptive, and not so much, there's a lot of arguments that these are related to nation state attacks because they do not look for specific ransom. Well, they ask for a ransom, but the purpose of the malware itself was actually to disrupt services. So in other words, to actually infect strategic organizations and disrupt those organizations, right? Now, another popular infection method is actually malvertising or malicious advertisement. And it's actually used the online advertisement, right? So ads from known and trusted websites, and even of course legitimate sites that then can actually redirect a user with little to no user interaction to then follow a link or to follow a website and then download the malware, in this case actually ransomware. Now, there's also another type of malware called Trojans, right? And Easy Counsel groups Trojans into some primary types, which is simply their way of organizing them, right? Some basic categories recognized by Easy Counsel include command shell Trojans, GUI Trojans or graphical user interface Trojans, HTTP or HTTPS Trojans, document Trojans, defacement Trojans, botnet Trojans, virtual network computing or VNC Trojans, and remote access Trojans. They also have other types of classifications like data hiding Trojans, banking Trojans, denial of service Trojans, FTP Trojans, software disabling Trojans, and covert channel Trojans as well. In reality, it is hard to place some Trojans on some of these actually malware in a single type because many have more than one function. Very popular one is actually a remote access Trojan, otherwise known and also remote access tool or RAT, that allows an attacker to full control the system from a command and control server, right? So from a remote location. Now, there are many different types of remote access tools now used by modern malware that can actually perform different processes or techniques in a compromised system, and it's usually setting up as a client server infrastructure. So you actually have a command and control server commanding or sending commands to the compromised systems. Now, there's also data hiding, and the idea behind this type of malware is to actually hide the user's data. This type of malware is also considered in some cases as ransomware. In this case, actually just hiding them instead of actually encrypting them. But Easy Counsel also categorized them as data hiding Trojans. Now, e-banking has been, of course, a victim. And of course, there are specific Trojans and malware that were designed to perform different operations against e-banking. And Zeus is actually an example of that, and there are many out there as well. And I'm going to be fairly brief in here. There are many different ones for your reference that I'm actually highlighting here, like specific malware for denial of service, for proxy, for FTP compromises, and security software disablers as well. And specifically, the security software disablers are malware that are designed to attack and kill antivirus or anti-malware functionalities or software, as well as in some cases firewalls, either personal firewalls or even traditional firewalls as well. Now, the goal of disabling these programs is, of course, to make it easy for the attacker to control the system. You also have keystroke loggers or key loggers, which are either software or hardware that can be used to record everything that a person types. So every time that actually you're typing, communication between you and your colleague, your coworker, your spouse, all those actually are being recorded. And in some of these programs, I actually can record even mouse movements and where the mouse actually is clicking, the websites that actually are visiting, and when a program is open. Now, I briefly mentioned spyware before, and a spyware is another form of malicious code that is similar to a Trojan. It is actually installed with your consent. In a lot of cases, actually, are installed at the moment that either a piece of hardware, let's say your laptop, your desktop, a tablet, a mobile phone, has been created. So, in other words, a supply chain attack, right? So you may actually have potentially, being compromised from the beginning, right? So spyware actually has grown to be a big problem. Usually is used for two purposes, either surveillance or in the case of advertisement, right? So malicious targeted advertisement that the spyware vendor has been paid to deliver. Now, many times, whether it's spyware sites or different malware sites and vendors use droppers to hide or drop their spyware or their malware components into the victim's computer. Basically, a dropper is just another name for a wrapper, because a dropper is actually just a standalone program that drops different types of standalone malware to a system. Now, there are different malware countermeasures out there. The prevention is always better than a cure, of course. Make sure that you always have the latest version of antivirus installed in your system or anti-malware. Unfortunately, nowadays, a lot of these antivirus or different systems can also be evaded. At the end of the day, what it is really advised is that you patch your system as soon as your vendor, whether it's Microsoft in the case of Windows, Apple in the case of Mac OS X, or your iPhones, your tablets, your Android devices, whenever they actually have a new patch because of vulnerabilities. That's why it's so important that not only you patch, but probably even automate some of that process. Most of modern operating system allows you to automate the patching of those, of course, with consent. Now, detecting malware is beyond the scope of this course and because of the exam, because it actually goes into a lot of forensics and analysis in depth. But keep in mind that actually finding and assessing malware can require a lot of work. However, I'm going to give you some high-level techniques that actually can be done for that. But again, that's a very high level. The first one is actually process monitoring. So monitoring what a process actually is doing. So process monitor can record temporal information such as the name of the process making a change. You can also specify filters to narrow down the capture criteria within a system, whether it's in Windows, Linux, or Mac OS X. In Windows, you actually have things like Task Manager. Of course, doing this by hand will actually be super time consuming. So there's many different techniques that you can actually do to monitor process and also to look for any type of new running processes that may actually appear in the system. The other one, of course, is a traditional PS command in Linux and Unix systems, netstat. So like netstat -ana shows a running list of open ports and processes within the system. You actually have cur ports, which is a Windows tool that is actually used to display a list of current processes on the local machine, TCP view, a Microsoft Computer Management Console, Process Viewer, and many others, right? Now, you can also analyze malware by doing static analysis or dynamic analysis. And static analysis is actually the way that you decompile, reverse engineer, and analyze malicious software, right? It is an increasingly outgrowth field or on-demand field because there's a lot of demand for malware and virus research and intent determination, right? We went over all the different types of malware, so you actually have to be familiar with a lot of these techniques as well. You can also use tools like IDA Pro, Evans Debugger, Oli debuggers that are debuggers that allow you for the analysis of binary code whenever source code is not available, right? Some of these tools are actually very, very expensive, especially IDA Pro, but they're extremely powerful whenever it comes to reverse engineering and to understanding how the actual malware is itself. Now, many techniques can be used to make this assembly challenging, by the attacker. So, of course, encryption, obfuscation, encoding, anti-virtual machine detection, and also anti-debugger, right? In some cases, actually obfuscating the way that probably can randomize the way that the malware may appear in a debugger. So another way is dynamic analysis, and dynamic analysis relates to the monitoring and analysis of computer activity and network traffic. It actually requires the ability to configure a networking device for monitoring or look for unusual or suspicious activity. Or in the case of virtual systems, right, you can actually create a VM, so a virtual machine, install a guest operating system in the VM that is affected by a specific malware, copy the malware, and then install it over the guest operating system, and then prepare for analysis. And you can actually use many different tools like Process Explorer from Wireshark and T-Shark, TCP dumps. Of course, there are many different vendors out there like Tripwire that actually has integrity verification tools, or you can actually use sandboxing, more modern sandboxing capabilities, right? So that allows you to see how the malware is behaving, potential, different command and control communication that it's actually trying to do, and then, of course, be able to potentially reverse engineer that malware. So as you can see, there's so many permutations of malicious code, different attack vectors and threat vectors. I definitely advise you to become familiar with them, even outside of the exam. Become familiar with the attack framework from MITRE. That's updated on a daily basis because it's a community-driven effort, and in there you actually see a lot more modern techniques that the threat actors are deploying nowadays.
All right, now we're going to get into concepts of attackers or attacking concepts, if you will. So there's a difference we need to be aware of between hacking and ethical hacking. And within hacking, there's the different mindsets. So if you talk to someone who grew up through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, and you talk to them about hacking, then it's all about digging into systems and understanding how they work. Nowadays, here in the tens of the 2000s, Hacking has taken on a different meaning, and that is exploiting vulnerabilities to gather information, the compromise of security controls to gather information. For whatever reason, it's the illegal access of information. When we contrast that with ethical hacking, the term hacking usually has a nefarious side to it. You know, if someone's a hacker, they're a bad guy. So what is ethical hacking? That is using tools and techniques, these same tools and techniques that the bad hacker would use in order to validate a system's security. So we are attacking our systems on purpose in order to verify that they are as secure as we think they are. We take that information, we report it to the appropriate people. These would be the administrators of those systems so that they can further secure their system. So there's a pretty big difference between hacking and ethical hacking. One is bad, one is good, basically. There's several different types of hackers out there, and the ethical hacker sort of falls in the top right side of the screen here. Black hat, these are your malicious folks that are out to do harm. They want to gather that information for whatever reason, however, usually illegal. So whether it's a ransomware, which is popping up in the news quite a bit these days, where you're holding data hostage for financial purposes. Gray hat. These are folks that could be considered a black hat hacker. However, they do focus both on offense and defense. Network security professionals could occasionally fall into this gray hat area. White hat, those are folks who have those black hat skills, but their purpose is to defend the network. So we know how the attackers are going to attack, and our job as a white hat hacker is to defend against those attacks. Script kiddie, these are folks that know the tools exist, they go download those tools, they run the tools, they impact the system, they get access to some data, but they don't really understand how it works. Whereas the black hat in the upper left, they're the ones that are writing these tools. Script kiddies are, just downloading and using them. Cyber terrorist is sort of the really bad side of the spectrum. These are the folks that possess those skills, but use them to further an ideology. It could be very dangerous. State-sponsored, these are the folks that work for governments, and their purpose is to attack other governments for whatever reason, both offense as well as protecting their government from attack by other governments. What is a hacktivist? Dictionary.com defines it as a computer hacker whose activity is aimed at promoting a social or political cause. So these are people who, just as an example, maybe attack the ASPCA because they don't agree with not harming animals. Maybe it's a meat eater. We have on the screen here Jeremy Hammond, who pled guilty to gathering information on law enforcement agencies and government contractors, actually attacking those systems and getting access to data. He's a very famous hacktivist.
It goes without saying that you have to be very aware of the different legal concepts related to penetration testing. You have to be aware of local laws to make sure that none of these activities, that you perform in a penetration testing engagement violate those laws. So, for example, if you collect packet captures or obtain information from, let's say, a voice over IP system or voicemails during a penetration testing, that action could be considered wiretapping in some countries. So you have to be very, very, very aware of those local laws. In addition to local laws, you will be responsible for creating certain types of legal documents like contracts, statement of works or SOWs, master service agreements or MSAs, and also non-disclosure agreements that either your client or you may actually sign in a unilateral, bilateral, or multilateral way as well. Now, contracts is one of the most important documents in a pen testing engagement. It actually specifies the terms of an agreement on how you will get paid, and also it provides a clear documentation of the services that will be performed. The document should be very specific, it should be easy to understand, and without any ambiguities. So any ambiguities will likely lead into not only customer dissatisfaction, but potentially legal friction. Now, legal advice, yes, from a lawyer, is always recommended for any type of contract. So if you're a pen tester that you're gonna start with, with your own company as a self-employee, definitely seek legal advice, specifically depending on your geographical location. Your customer may also engage their legal department or an outside agency to review the contract. A customer may also specify and demand any information collected, that it should be, of course, not made available outside of the country where you actually perform the test. So you have to be very conscious on that, especially if you flew overseas to perform a penetration testing engagement and now you're going back to your country of residence. In some cases, it will not be accepted either by the organization or by the local country laws of that geographical region. Also, the customer may specify that you, as a penetration tester, cannot remove any personally identifiable information that may be the subject to specific laws or regulations like GDPR, any type of regulation related to privacy, without first committing to be bound by those laws and regulations or without a written authorization of the organization. So also your customer can review the penetration testing contract or agreement to make sure that it does not permit or allow more risk that is actually intended to resolve in some cases. Another very important element of your contract and pre-engagement task is that you must obtain a signature from a proper signing authority within that contracting company, so in other words, your customer, and that includes the written authorization of the work to be performed. One of the most crucial documents is called the SOW, or the Statement of Work, and it's actually a document that specifies the activities to be performed during the penetration testing engagement. It can be used to define some of the most common elements like the actual project timeline, so the penetration testing timeline, including the report delivery schedule, the scope of the work to be performed, the location of the work, geographical location, or the network location of where you're actually going to be performing the penetration test. Also, special technical and non-technical requirements, the payment schedule, so how you're going to get paid, and any other miscellaneous items that may not be part of the main negotiation, but that need to be listed and tracked because they could pose problems during their overall engagement. The SOW can actually be a standalone document, or they can also be part of another document called an MSA, or a Master Service Agreement. Now, MSAs, or Master Service Agreements, are very, very popular nowadays. They are actually contracts that can be used to quickly negotiate the work to be performed. So if you have a Master Service Agreement, that means that the same terms do not have to be renegotiated every time that you actually perform work for a customer. So these documents or these MSAs can actually be very beneficial whenever you perform a penetration test and you know that you will be rehired by the same organization on a recurring basis to actually perform, either additional tests or test other areas of the company, or to verify that the security posture of the organization has improved throughout time as a result of the prior engagement and remediation. Another legal document is an NDA, and that's a non-disclosure agreement. And it's a legal document and contract between you and the organization that has hired you to do a penetration testing. Now, an NDA specifies and defines confidential material, how it's actually going to be handled, of course, keeping the information by both parties in a confidential manner. And there are 3 different types or general types of NDAs. They can be classified as unilateral. So in that case, only one party discloses specific information to the other party, and the information must be kept, of course, protected and not disclosed. So for example, the organization that actually hired you should include an NDA, or may include an NDA that, for certain information that you should not disclose. Let's say they actually are creating a new widget to be sold, or a new technology, or of course, and you're going to be testing some of that environment. Of course, you cannot disclose that information to unauthorized individuals. Another type of NDA is a bilateral NDA, and a bilateral NDA is also referred to as a mutual or two-way NDA. Now, bilateral NDAs is whenever both parties share sensitive information, so not only your client to you, but you may also share some sensitive information with them that should not be disclosed in any other way. Now, there's a third type of NDA, and that's a multilateral NDA. And this type of NDA involves 3 or more parties, with at least one of the parties actually disclosing some sensitive information that should not be disclosed to any other entity. So, for example, let's say you're doing a penetration testing engagement to a large organization that just acquired a smaller company, and now all the 3 parties actually need to share that NDA. That can be via a multilateral NDA. Another example is that the company or the organization that you're going to be testing the systems, they're going to be performing the penetration testing engagement, it may actually have a business partner that now needs to be involved. And of course, we may actually have a situation that may be a multilateral NDA that will restrict certain information to be disclosed. Now, you also have to become familiar with any export control restrictions that may be present in the country where a penetration test will be performed. So, for example, there may be tools, software, hardware, many different type of things that cannot be exported outside of the country, specifically around cryptographic software or encryption technologies, right? So for several years, more than 40 countries actually have been negotiating export controls under an arrangement called the Wassenaar Arrangement, and that was actually established for export control of actually conventional arms and dual use of goods and technologies. And nowadays there's a lot of talk about potentially regulating specific cybersecurity technologies of not being exported or imported to certain countries. Of course, you also have to be aware of different corporate policies that your customer may actually have that need to be taken into consideration when performing a penetration testing, right? And also any other type of local laws as well, depending on the country that you will be performing the penetration testing engagement. In this lesson, we will go over some of the most popular penetration testing methodologies, as well as the EC Council system hacking methodology. But starting with the penetration testing execution standard is actually one of the most popular penetration testing methodologies in the industry. The second one that I'm highlighting here is the OWASP testing methodology or the guide that is part of the OWASP testing project, and it is tailored around hacking web applications, but a few of the things actually can be adopted for other types of penetration testing as well. Now, another one that is very popular is the NIST 800-115 special publication, which is titled The Technical Guide to Information Security Testing and Assessment, and also the open source security testing methodology. Now, in this diagram, what I did is I separated the main milestones based on the penetration test execution standard lifecycle for the penetration testing lifecycle. So you have things like pre-engagement tasks and interaction that includes scoping, includes things like your legal documentation, like your SOW or the statement of work. It also includes things like the rules of engagement document, how you're actually going to be performing the penetration testing engagement, and any other type of legal documents, like for example non-disclosure agreements and so on, right? And it's one of the most important phases because that's actually what it defines the scope and how the penetration testing engagement will take place. Now, during the penetration testing, you start by gathering intelligence both in a passive and an active way. So a lot of people actually refer to that as active and passive reconnaissance. Once you actually complete the reconnaissance phase, you go into threat modeling. You perform your threat model. You start actually doing vulnerability analysis. Whenever you find vulnerabilities, you try to exploit them. And depending on the scope, you can move into post-exploitation, into the fact that you demonstrate how an attacker can potentially do lateral movement or pivoting, compromise other systems, and even potentially exfiltrate data from the organization. At the end of the engagement, then of course you create a report that has a lot of different elements, and we're actually going to be going over this course into a lot of the best practices on how to create that report. And of course, these are the high-level milestones of the penetration testing lifecycle. Now, Easy Counsel has something very similar. They actually start with footprinting, scanning, enumeration, vulnerability analysis, and then they go over what they consider system hacking. So gaining access, that means cracking passwords, escalating privileges, maintaining access, executing applications in a post-exploitation phase, hiding files, exfiltrating files, and everything. And at the end, cleaning your logs and covering your tracks. So as you see, different types of illustrations for pretty much the same life cycle, across all these different methodologies. As you know, attackers follow a fixed methodology. So as a pen tester, you have to think like one. So it is very important to understand the methodology. Now, the following are the attack phases that are outlined by Easy Counsel. It starts with performing reconnaissance and footprinting. Then you move into scanning and enumeration. Then you perform vulnerability analysis, and hopefully you should be able to find vulnerabilities and exploit them to gain access to the system. Then you perform tasks like privilege escalation, you move laterally, you maintain access, then you execute potential applications or install backdoors, potentially exfiltrate information, of course, if it's within the scope of the penetration testing engagement, and then you finish by clearing your logs and covering your tracks. Now, there are several industry-wide penetration testing methodologies that are pretty similar. One of the most popular ones is the penetration testing execution standard. I am showing a diagram that I made here that is aligned with the penetration testing execution standard, and there you actually see similar attack phases. Now, there are several other penetration testing methodologies out in the industry. OWASP has a testing guide for hacking web applications or performing penetration testing against web applications. NIST also has a technical guide to information security testing and assessment. It's a special publication 800-115. And also there is an open source security testing methodology manual, or OSS TMM. Now, for the purpose of the CEH exam, you need to be familiar with the Easy Counsel methodology.
Attack types. So if we need to classify attacks into various buckets, these are the buckets we'd put them into: operating system, application, shrink-wrap code, and misconfiguration. So when it comes to operating system attacks, the purpose here is to get access to the system by exploiting a flaw in the operating system itself. So not an application that you've installed subsequent to actually installing the operating system, but getting access to the operating system itself through a flaw. What are our attack vectors for operating system attacks? You can see here buffer overflows, software defects. Again, these are software defects in the operating system itself. The patches that have been applied or not applied, implementations of protocols. So when an operating system vendor creates the operating system and they need to code in, say, TCP as an example, how they implement that based on RFC standards, it should conform. However, they might unintentionally introduce a vulnerability in their actual application of the code. And the last one here for attack vectors, authentication scheme. So this is the methods used to actually authenticate a user. Next bucket, application attacks. So this is gaining access to the system by attacking an application that system is running. As an example, say Apache running on Linux. If we exploit Apache and gain access to the system, then that's an application attack. Methods of attack here, buffer overflows, software defects, as they say professionally, and bugs, to the rest of the world. SQL injection, cross-site scripting, denial of service, man in the middle. So all of these different methods here that you see for application attacks, we're actually going to be looking at in the other lessons in this course. Shrink wrap code. So this one is somewhat unique in that it's an attack on an operating system or application directly after it's been installed. So this is a defect that exists in code as shipped and maybe subsequently patched, but maybe those patches hadn't been applied. I touched on the first bullet there of examples, software defect in the first shipped version. Some more examples here. Say a web server ships with some default CGI scripts that you can use to just test functionality. If those aren't removed, then that's a possible method of exploitation. Also, default passwords could be a way to get in if those passwords hadn't been changed after the application had been installed. And finally, misconfiguration, gaining access to a system by exploiting a misconfiguration. And this usually just comes down to administrator education. As an example here, improper permissions on SQL users. If I'm an SQL database administrator and some application developer comes to me and says, I need to write data to this table, and let's say I go and create that user, but I don't apply the permissions I should, then perhaps they can access other tables. Another example of common implemented access list, that being permit all, doesn't really enforce security if you just allow everything.
Let's go over cybersecurity policies and what they are, how to create them, and what is actually the purpose of them. The role of policy is to codify some guiding principles, also to shape some behavior within an organization or even a specific individual. Also to provide guidance to those who are tasked by making present and future decisions, right? They serve as an implementation roadmap. So think about that for a second, right? Now, a cybersecurity policy is a directive that defines how the organization is actually going to protect its information, assets, and also their systems to ensure compliance with legal, regulatory requirements, and at the end of the day, to maintain an environment that supports the guiding principles of the corporation or the organization. Now, the main objective of any cybersecurity policy or any type of corresponding program is to protect the organization, also its employees, its customers, its vendors or partners from any type of harm resulting from whether it's intentionally or accidental damage or misuse or disclosure of information, for example, like a breach, as well as to protect the integrity of the information, the data, and to ensure the availability of information systems, right? Now, the word cyber is actually nothing new, right? So it's been since the early 90s, right? So we actually have the prefix cyber. So now, of course, we refer to this as cybersecurity policies. In the past were InfoSec policies. We already went over the differences between traditional InfoSec and cybersecurity, so we're not going to be repetitive here. But at the end of the day, what you have to understand is, what are assets, what are you actually trying to protect, and how the policies should be constructed in a way that allows you to protect, your environment in an effective manner, right? Now, there are many different elements and characteristics that a policy should have to be successful, right? So we call it successful policy characteristics. The first one is actually that needs to be endorsed. So the policy has to have the support of management. It has to be relevant, so that is applicable to the organization and to the modern days. It has to be realistic, and at the end of the day, it has to make sense. So if you have a policy that is actually not realistic, relevant, or endorsed, of course you can throw it to the trash because it's useless. It also has to be attainable, so it can be successfully implemented. If you have a perfect policy out there into the fact that is very detailed and everything, but it's not attainable, of course, it's also useless. Adaptable. So the policy actually has to accommodate any type of changes, especially around business transitions and shifts on business environments. It also has to be enforceable. So if you actually have the most beautiful policy, but if you don't enforce it, it's also useless. Now, it also has to be inclusive. So the policy scope includes or should include all relevant parties as well, right? So that's what we define as the main successful policy characteristics. Another thing that I want to highlight is that if the cybersecurity policy is not written in a way that is easy to understand, it can also become useless. In some cases, policies are very difficult to understand, and if they are not clear and easy to understand, they will not be followed by your employees or any other stakeholders within the organization. Now, the challenges of today's global governance is actually to establish a shared responsibility for the most intractable problems that we're actually trying to solve around the globe. This is a new global environment that actually presents a lot of challenges in today's environment for regulation, for creating a good cybersecurity policy, life cycle, and so on. Regardless of whether a policy is actually based on guiding principles or regulations, its success depends in large upon how the organization approaches the task of policy development, publication, adoption, and review. So for your referencing here, I actually have an illustration of the policy life cycle that includes the development phase, the publication phase, the adoption phase, and the review. I also have the different types of policy life cycle responsibilities. We will not go over each one of them. This is actually for your reference, for you to at least have an understanding of the different positions and the responsibilities in each of the phases of the policy life cycle, starting from the development phase all the way to the review and auditing phase of the policy.